Egoism, psychological and ethical egoism. Now, psychological egoism is the theory that we always do that act that we perceive to be in our own best self-interest. We don't really have a choice about this. It is the state of being of our mind. It is psychological. Psychological means derived from the mind. So this acting in our best perceived self-interest is psychological. In other words, it is derived from the mind. In other words, it is coming from the state of being of the mind. So it's the way you are. I mean, you just think about the way we use that word psychological. When somebody has a psychological problem, is it something that they can get rid of easily? No, it's not. If somebody has a psychological problem, it's usually something that is ingrained in the mind. Well, psychological egoism is saying that this acting in our best self-interest, our best perceived self-interest, is psychological. It's ingrained in the mind. It's part of the state of being of our mind. So, you always act in your own perceived self-interest or best self-interest. So imagine two people married right there. Look at that picture right there of those two lovebirds. They look like they love each other. Maybe they're married. Married couple. Generally, when you have a married couple and it's a successful marriage, they do things for each other. Like the husband or may do some sort of act just for the sake of his spouse. A wife may do some act just for the sake of her husband. This happens all the time, or they think that this happens. Because according to psychological egoism, some spouse, some husband or wife doing some sacrificial act for the sake of the other person because they supposedly love them. According to psychological egoism, that is not the case, because we all act according to our perceived best self-interest. So if the husband, maybe cooks breakfast in bed for his wife, and he's doing it because he thinks he loves her, right? And he wants to do something just for her. It's going to be a lot of trouble for him because he has to wake up early and do and cook. Maybe he's not that good at cooking, so he has to learn it, but he does it. He thinks he's doing it for his wife because he loves her. But no, according to psychological egoism, he's probably doing it because it makes him feel good, for his own self-interest, or he's doing it to get something else out of it, for his own best self-interest. All right. Well, look at that. Let's go further here. Look at that picture on the right. That father right there with his little baby. And he's probably thinking right now, boy, I'm going to do anything for this baby. I'll do anything. Right? So typically, parents think this way when they have children. And it seems like they do things for their children. Like they do things that are sacrificial because they love them. Right? They get up in the morning, change the diapers, they go to work so they can get money and they can feed their children, because it appears as if they love their children. And so they're doing all these selfless acts. But this is an illusion, because according to psychological egoism, we all act according to our perceived best self-interest. So the father or the mother who's doing all these acts for their child, feeding them, going to work, buying them toys, all this stuff, they're doing it probably because it makes them feel good. Because you don't got a choice. If you're doing some act, you're making some choices and you're doing some act, you're doing it because it's for your perceived best self-interest, because your brain is just hardwired this way. It's in your nature. So it doesn't matter what it is. So when we talk about this idea of love, and especially the Christian idea of love, The Christian idea of love is that you sacrifice for another person. That's the Christian idea of love. It's a sacrificial love. It is charity. Okay? Even the Latin word for the Christian love is caritas, which you can see from that we get the word charity, because that's what Christian love is. But according to psychological egoism, when somebody does charity, they're not really doing it for the sake of the other person. They are doing it for their best perceived self-interest. So, I mean, you can just further conclude from that that psychological egoism, if psychological egoism is true, then this idea of Christian love is not true. And a religion like Christianity, I mean, that's a big part of Christianity right there. In fact, you can even say if there's no Christian love, then there's really no Christianity. Now, here's a critique of psychological egoism. It confuses consequence with purpose. Now, look at those people right there eating dinner. You have the food on the plates. Everybody's having a good time, and they're eating. And then look at the picture on the right. That's the result. Look at all those dirty dishes. What is the purpose of these people eating dinner? What's the purpose? Is the purpose to have dirty dishes? No, that is a consequence of eating. The purpose of you eating is to fill yourself and to survive. So those people having dinner, first of all, the purpose of them eating is they need to eat or else they're going to die. Another purpose of them eating is the get together. They want to get together with their friends and family and, talk and have a good time and something like that. That's another purpose. You cannot say, or you wouldn't say, that the purpose of them eating is to have dirty dishes, because that is clearly a consequence. The point being made here is that we have to make distinctions in order to avoid error. And a critique of psychological egoism is they're not making a distinction, a very simple distinction between a purpose and a consequence. So if some father buys a present for their child because it's their birthday, the father probably feels good about it, about seeing his son or daughter happy with the present. So, but that doesn't mean that his purpose was to feel good. His purpose was to give the present to the child so that the child can enjoy it for the sake of the child. And as a consequence, the father feels good about it. So this is a very simple and important distinction to make. And it is a powerful critique of psychological egoism. Psychological egoism is stating something about the human being. It is giving a philosophy of the human person. Okay, that is always necessary before some sort of ethical propositions are given. All right, so here we have ethical egoism. The theory that everyone ought always to do those acts that will best serve his or her own best self-interest. So ethical egoism is an ethical theory. It is not stating the nature of the human being. It is telling people what they ought to do. That's why you see that word right there, ought. The theory that everyone ought. In other words, the theory that everyone should. Every time you see those words, should and ought, you know you are looking at morality. You are looking at ethics. You're looking at statements about ethics. So that's what ethical egoism is. That's how it's different from psychological egoism. Psychological egoism is stating something about the nature of the human being, about the human person. And ethical egoism is stating what the human being should do. Here we see that psychological egoism it naturally leads to ethical egoism. Because what psychological egoism is saying is it is your nature to act in your best perceived self-interest. And if something is in your nature, then you probably should go with it if something's in your nature. So eating hay, look at that picture right there. That's hay. Eating hay is not in your nature. So it's not a good idea for you to have dinner with a plate full of hay. You're not going to be able to digest it. It's not good for you. And it follows that somebody cannot give you a command. It would not be a good law for somebody to say you have to eat hay 3 times a day. Why? Why would that not be a good law or a good moral command? Because it's not in your nature. But look at the apple. I mean, you hear it all the time that you should eat apples, you should eat fruit. Everybody's always saying this. Why? Because it's in your nature. In fact, your body needs the vitamins and the minerals from apples. And so your body needs it naturally. It's in your nature to eat apples. So because it's in your nature, if a parent tells their child, hey, you should eat an apple a day, I mean, that's a good moral command right there. So with psychological egoism, if it is in our nature to act in our best perceived self-interests, then it follows that we should do that. Right? We should act in our best perceived self-interest. And that's what ethical egoism is saying. So again, psychological egoism is stating something about the human person. And ethical egoism is stating what the human being should do. In other words, it's stating what the ethics should be for the human person. Now, a critique of ethical egoism, it is based on psychological egoism. So if psychological egoism happens to be false, then ethical egoism would be false. Psychological egoism is the basis for ethical egoism. All right. So in other words, if you have the ethical theory of ethical egoism, that you ought to act in your best perceived self-interest, if you have that ethical theory, but it's not in your nature to do that, then ethical egoism has no basis. Because we only ought to do things that we are able to do, and that are in our nature. So if ethical egoism goes against our nature, then you shouldn't do it. Just know that if psychological egoism happens to be false, then ethical egoism does not have a basis to stand on.